The war in Ukraine started in February 2022 on the premise that Russia would be able to achieve a quick victory that would take a few weeks at most. But here we are, closing in on the end of the fourth year of the war, and it seems there's no end in sight. Both Russia and Ukraine are basically in a war of attrition. And if current trends continue, 2026 will mark the year when the full weight of Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategic miscalculation comes crashing down on Russia itself. The warning signs are everywhere. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stated in October that Russia is running out of money, troops and ideas. But this isn't just Western optimism talking. The hard data from the battlefield, Russia's own economic indicators, and the Kremlin's increasingly desperate measures all point to the same conclusion. Russia is eating itself alive to sustain this war, and 2026 may be the year when there's simply nothing left to consume. So let's examine exactly why 2026 is shaping up to be Russia's worst year ever, and why Putin's war machine may finally grind to a halt, starting with its military equipment. Russia began this war with one of the world's largest arsenals. Thousands of tanks sat in storage facilities across the country, a lot of them being leftovers from the Soviet Union's massive military-industrial complex. On paper, Russia looked unstoppable. But while the saying, quantity has a quality all its own, should have merit, it turns out that quantity is rusting, outdated, and impossible to maintain. According to Oryx, which meticulously tracks visually confirmed equipment losses, Russia has lost over 23,400 units of military equipment through October 2025. Of these, roughly 13,600 are armored vehicles, including 4,211 tanks destroyed or damaged in just 43 months of fighting. And remember, these are the only losses that were visually confirmed through satellite imagery, drone footage, and independent sources. The actual numbers are almost certainly higher, with analysts suggesting visual confirmation captures between 80 and 90% of total losses. But the tanks being lost now are also far better than what's coming out of storage to replace them. Russia started the war with approximately 3,300 modern tanks in active service, including upgraded T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. The country also had somewhere between 5,000 and 17,500 older Soviet-era tanks in storage, though the actual condition of these vehicles was always questionable. More importantly, Russia has been pulling these older tanks out of storage at an accelerating rate. By May 2022, just 3 months into the invasion, Soviet-era T-62 started appearing on the battlefield. By November 2024, Russia had resorted to deploying T-34 tanks, which were relics from World War II used primarily for military parades. And the production numbers are even worse. Russia can manufacture approximately 400 modern tanks per year, namely T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. Over the 42 months of war through mid-2025, that adds up to roughly 875 new tanks. But Russia has lost well over 3,000 of these tanks. Even accounting for tanks pulled from storage and refurbished, the math simply doesn't work. Russia is burning through its tank inventory at a rate that far exceeds its ability to replace them. And the replacement capacity is actually getting worse, not better. Russia's ability to refurbish stored tanks has declined dramatically, from over 120 tanks per month at the beginning of 2022 to just 35 per month by mid-2025. The reason is simple. Russia took the best tanks out of storage first. What remains are increasingly decrepit vehicles that require more work, more parts, and more time to make battlefield ready. Many are simply beyond repair. The International Institute for Strategic Studies delivered a devastating assessment in their 2025 report. Russia will not have sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026 if it maintains the same operational tempo and suffers the same losses as in 2024. And tanks are just the beginning of Russia's equipment crisis. Russia's artillery situation is, if anything, even more humiliating. According to a Reuters analysis, North Korea is now supplying up to 100% of Russian artillery shells used in Ukraine. The supposed second most powerful military in the world is entirely dependent on ammunition from one of the most isolated and impoverished nations on Earth. North Korea has sent containers to Russia that could hold between 4 and 6 million artillery shells over the course of a year and a half. Russia's domestic production, by comparison, reached approximately 2.3 million shells in 2024, and that's short of its target of 3 million. Meanwhile, Russian forces are using approximately 10,000 shells per day, which works out to 3.65 million shells annually. Even with North Korean imports, Russia is barely keeping pace with its consumption rate. But here's the truly pathetic part. Some reports suggest approximately half of the North Korean shells don't even work. These munitions were manufactured in the 1970s and 1980s, pulled from old stockpiles with minimal inspection. Russia has to perform additional quality control checks before use, a process that its already strained military-industrial complex can barely handle. Russia's response to this ammunition crisis is equally telling. According to leaked documents, Moscow is rushing to complete a new TNT and RDX explosives production facility in Siberia, located some 1,800 miles east of Moscow. It's as far away from the front line as possible, just in case Ukraine gets even better at long-range strikes. The situation in Russian aviation is equally catastrophic. In 2022, shortly after the invasion began, the Russian government announced plans to procure more than 1,000 new civil aircraft by 2030. By early 2025, Russian factories had produced exactly 5. These production targets were quietly slashed, and defense spending on aircraft production was reduced due to so-called ongoing delays and manufacturing challenges. Military aviation faces similar problems. A 2024 RAND Corporation report estimated that the Russian Air Force was operating at less than 75% of its pre-war capacity. Russian aircraft initially flew over 150 sorties per day, pushing older airframes far beyond their intended operational limits. RAND estimated that Russia was actively losing approximately 60 aircraft per year just from overuse and lack of proper maintenance. Russia's military-industrial complex can only produce 26 new military aircraft annually, including just 14 fighter jets. The civilian and military aviation crises are interconnected. Both industries rely on the same spare parts, maintenance facilities, and engineering expertise. Western sanctions have cut off access to critical components, while the engineering talent needed to maintain aircraft is either dying in the war or fleeing the country. Russia has been trying to replace Western civilian aircraft with domestically produced alternatives, but the numbers show this effort is failing catastrophically. Then there are Russia's air defense systems, the S-300 and S-400 platforms that were supposed to be the pinnacle of Russian military technology. Over 30 S-300 and S-400 launchers and radars have been visually confirmed as destroyed by Ukraine since the start of the war, with a total of 340 surface-to-air missile systems lost. Even more embarrassingly, Israel reportedly dismantled all 4 S-300 systems that Russia sold to Iran with seeming ease, showing the limitations of these supposedly advanced weapons against Western military technology. The equipment situation has gotten so dire that Russia has had to pull S-300 systems from Kaliningrad. Russia is literally leaving its most vulnerable territories exposed because it doesn't have enough equipment to defend both the front lines and its own borders. As we head into 2026, Russia will likely see its equipment losses accelerating, its production capacity declining, and its stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment possibly exhausted. And if Russia's equipment situation is catastrophic, its manpower crisis is potentially civilization ending. Western estimates suggest that Russia has suffered over 1 million total casualties, killed and wounded combined, since February 2022. By mid-October 2025, casualties had grown by almost 60% in a single year, reaching somewhere between 984,000 and 1,438,000 total. The correct number is likely closer to the higher end of that estimate. The dead alone number between 190,000 and 480,000. And yet over the summer of 2025, Putin's armies failed to capture a single large city despite these horrific losses. To put this in perspective, the Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted a decade and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, resulted in approximately 15,000 to 25,000 Soviet deaths. The current war in Ukraine has potentially exceeded that death toll by a factor of 10 to 20 in less than half the time. But the casualty figures don't capture the full scope of Russia's demographic catastrophe. Russia's fertility rate crashed to between 1.2 and 1.4 during the economic chaos of the 1990s, following the Soviet Union's collapse. It recovered somewhat to around 1.8 by the 2010s, but this is still well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman needed to maintain a stable population. This means Russia was already facing a demographic crisis before the war began, with a shortage of young men in the prime military and working age. Now, the war is compounding this crisis exponentially. Between 190,000 and 480,000 young men are dead. Another 800,000 or more are severely wounded, many permanently disabled. And these are the same men who should be starting families, entering the workforce, and building Russia's economic future. An entire generation of Russian men either doesn't exist or is being systematically exterminated in Ukraine. The consequences of this demographic devastation will echo through Russian society for decades. These are missing soldiers, workers who will never contribute to the economy, taxpayers who will never fund Russia's social programs. The demographic hole Russia is creating will take generations to fill, if it can be filled at all. And Russia isn't just losing soldiers on the battlefield. The country has suffered a massive brain drain since the war began. Estimates suggest that around 1 million Russians have fled the country since February 2022. These are the engineers, programmers, doctors, and entrepreneurs that any modern economy needs to function, and most of them don't plan on coming back. Russia's response to its manpower shortage reveals just how desperate the situation has become. The Kremlin has been forced to recruit from increasingly desperate pools of manpower. They've emptied prisons, offering convicted criminals pardons in exchange for military service. These ex-convicts, trained in modern warfare and released into society with legal impunity, are now terrorizing Russian communities. The recruitment situation is getting progressively worse. Medusa reported that the second quarter of 2025 saw less than a third of soldiers signing contracts compared to the same period in 2024. Regional recruitment bonuses have also been slashed dramatically, with some areas cutting them fivefold. Russia is offering less money because it has less money to offer, even as it desperately needs more troops. Russia planned to establish 50 new military training schools to address a critical shortage of officers. Only 2 have been confirmed as actually underway. Meanwhile, Russian officials have reported shortages ranging from 160,000 to 400,000 workers and engineers in the defense industry. The most conservative estimate suggests 80,000 engineers are needed just to maintain current production levels. As 2026 approaches, Russia faces a manpower crisis with no good solutions since the demographic damage is already done. The best-case scenario is decades of economic stagnation and social problems as Russia struggles with an aging population, a shortage of working-age men, and hundreds of thousands of traumatized veterans who cannot reintegrate into society. The worst-case scenario is demographic collapse that threatens the existence of the Russian state itself. The spiraling numbers also affect Russia's economy as a whole, and 2026 is shaping up to be the year when the structural damage becomes impossible to ignore or paper over. Let's start with Russia's primary revenue source, oil and gas exports. For decades, energy exports have been Russia's economic lifeline, at times accounting for up to 50% of federal budget revenue. This money funded everything from military modernization to social programs, to Putin's patronage networks that keep the regime in power. But Western sanctions, combined with global market shifts, are systematically dismantling this revenue stream. By June 2025, Russia's oil and gas budget revenues had plummeted by 33.7% year-over-year. Russia has attempted to evade sanctions through various schemes. It assembled a shadow fleet of tankers to transport oil to willing buyers, including some EU states. But even this workaround is failing. China and India know that Russia is desperate and are demanding steep discounts, sometimes 30 to 40% below market rates. European Union members with access to the Baltic have begun sanctioning vessels in the Shadow Fleet, preventing Russia from using them. Simultaneously, the EU is moving toward imposing region-wide price caps on Russian oil that could trigger yet another revenue decline. Most Chinese banks have stopped trading in rubles altogether, fearing being cut off from the US dollar system as retaliation for conducting business with Russia. Russia's second major export sector, arms sales, has virtually disappeared. A Jamestown Foundation report documented a 92% drop in arms exports between 2021 and 2024. Russia's military-industrial complex has turned almost entirely inward, desperately trying to meet domestic demand for the war in Ukraine. Countries that once bought Russian weapons have either been sanctioned themselves, like Iran and Syria, or have sought alternative suppliers, like India, which is increasingly buying from Western and domestic sources. This collapse in arms exports removes another major revenue stream precisely when Russia needs it most. Military equipment that could have been sold for hard currency is instead being destroyed in Ukrainian fields, generating zero revenue while costing Russia money to produce. The Russian government has responded to collapsing revenues with a series of desperate measures that amount to economic self-cannibalization. In 2025, Russia raised taxes on companies and personal incomes. In 2025, officials discussed raising the value-added tax or VAT on goods and services. Plans for 2026 include further increases to personal or corporate income taxes, additional tax brackets, and lowering the revenue threshold for companies required to pay taxes. The result is a system where Russian citizens are taxed more heavily while having fewer employment opportunities. All of this money is still being siphoned away by the military. Russia's defense and security spending for 2025 exceeded 8% of GDP and accounted for 40% of total federal expenditure, a record not seen since the Soviet Union's Cold War era. In 2026, this is expected to fall to slightly under 38% of all government spending, as the government needs to lower the budget for the first time in years. Think about it. Russia is trying to plow full steam ahead into Ukraine, and it's forced to reduce how much money it's spending. As Russia's conventional military capabilities erode and its economy contracts, the Kremlin has increasingly resorted to tactics of desperation, strategies that reveal how far Putin's strategic position has fallen since the heady days of February 2022, when Russian forces rolled toward Kyiv expecting a quick victory. One of the most visible signs of Russia's desperation has been the dramatic escalation in long-range strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and population centers. The strategic logic is brutally simple. If Russia can't win on the battlefield, perhaps it can make life in Ukraine so unbearable that Ukrainian resistance collapses. Russian officials have openly discussed creating conditions that will make large portions of Ukraine uninhabitable, forcing mass displacement and destroying civilian morale. But this strategy has failed spectacularly. Consider Pokrovsk, the city in eastern Donbass that's been under Russian assault for over a year. Russia has thrown massive forces at this city, suffering approximately 16,000 casualties in the area since late August 2025 alone. The city has been subjected to constant artillery bombardment and airstrikes. Russian forces have even managed some limited penetrations, with several small Russian infantry units establishing positions inside the city. Yet Pokrovsk still stands. Ukrainian forces have reportedly held defensive lines and inflicted devastating losses on Russian attackers. If Russia can't break Ukrainian resistance in Pokrovsk, After dedicating such enormous resources, chances are it won't dampen Ukraine's morale in the slightest. History has shown that attacking civilians rarely causes national surrender. The Blitz didn't break Britain. Ukrainian civilians, having witnessed Russian occupation firsthand, understand exactly what Russian victory would mean. Every missile that strikes a civilian target only reinforces what Ukrainians have to lose if they surrender. Russia's increasing reliance on long-range strikes also reveals the weakness of its ground forces. The shift from combined arms offensives with armor support to human wave attacks supplemented by missiles indicates that Russia cannot achieve its objectives through conventional military means. Another sign of desperation is Russia's escalating dependence on North Korea and China. Let's go back to the munitions issue, where Russia is taking every artillery shell North Korea can produce. First, it's humiliating. The supposed second strongest military in the world is relying on one of the poorest and most isolated countries on Earth for basic ammunition. Second, it's unreliable. Approximately half of North Korea's shells malfunction, creating additional quality control burdens for Russia's already strained military industry. Third, it hands Kim Jong-un enormous leverage over Putin. North Korea can essentially blackmail Russia by threatening to reduce shipments, and there's nothing Putin can do about it. The relationship with China is even more complicated. China has been Russia's economic lifeline, buying oil and gas at discounted prices and providing access to manufactured goods that Western sanctions have cut off. Chinese components have found their way into Russian weapon systems, helping sustain military production despite Western technology bans. China has become Russia's most important trading partner, and Russia has become increasingly dependent on Chinese goodwill for economic survival. But this relationship is fundamentally asymmetric. China is doing Russia a favor, not forming an equal partnership. Chinese banks have largely stopped trading in rubles, fearing Western sanctions. China demands steep discounts on Russian energy, knowing Russia has no alternatives. China watches Russian desperation grow and adjusts its terms accordingly. More critically, China's tolerance for the Ukraine war is not unlimited. If the conflict escalates in ways that threaten to draw in NATO directly, or if Western pressure on China for supporting Russia becomes too costly, Beijing could dramatically reduce its support. China's primary interest is China, not Russia. General Secretary Xi Jinping has no interest in being dragged into a war with the United States over Ukraine alone. So what does 2026 have in store for Russia? The evidence suggests that 2026 will be the year when all of the crises we mentioned might reach a critical point. Russia will likely face the fact that it can no longer sustain high-intensity combat operations due to equipment exhaustion, manpower shortages, and economic constraints. The government will be forced to choose between dramatically reducing military operations and accepting strategic defeat, enacting a general mobilization that could trigger domestic unrest, or continuing at the current pace and face comprehensive military and economic collapse. For Putin personally, 2026 may present the most dangerous moment of his political career. His legitimacy rests on projecting strength and delivering results. The war in Ukraine was supposed to restore Russian prestige, reunify Russian lands, and demonstrate that Russia remained a great power that could operate independently of Western constraints. Instead, it's exposed Russian military weakness, decimated Russia's economy, and united the West against Russia in ways not seen since the Cold War. Putin's inner circle has tolerated this catastrophe as long as they believed Putin could deliver victory or at least avoid catastrophic defeat. As 2026 progresses and the full scope of Russia's losses become impossible to hide, these calculations may change. If key regime insiders begin to believe that Putin has become a liability rather than an asset, and that continued support for his war will threaten their own survival, the regime could fracture. This doesn't necessarily mean democratic revolution or Western-style regime change. More likely, we might see an internal power struggle among competing factions of the security services and military leadership, each attempting to position itself as the alternative that can salvage something from Putin's disaster. The result could be utter chaos that nuclear armed states are supposed to avoid. Thanks for watching. Now, to understand how the war in Ukraine has affected not only Russia but also China, check out this video. And to stay informed about the continuing evolution of this historic conflict, subscribe to The Military Show for daily updates on global military affairs.